Hey there, 7th grade. Tonight we are beginning Chapter 2, which begins our study of biology on the smallest level, the cell. We'll begin by discussing cell chemistry, which is what makes all of life function, and that will be in Section 1. Next, we'll move to investigating the various parts of the cell in Section 2. Then, we're going to move on to Section 3, in which we'll investigate how molecules get into and out of the cell. And then finally, we'll wrap up with Section 4, in which we'll discover how the cell gets its energy. I think this chapter is super interesting, but also it's the longest and most challenging of the year. So we'll go slowly and break up the material into bite-sized portions. I also have some interesting and fun ideas for new activities and labs for these 4 sections, so get excited. Alright, let's focus on Section 1. I will present Section 2.1, titled Cells and Life, in 3 video lectures, because there's a lot of complicated information to cover, and I don't want to overwhelm you. By the time we're done with the 3 lectures for this section, I would like for you to be able to do the following. First, I'd like for you to be able to explain how the cell theory developed. Second, I'd like for you to be able to distinguish between inorganic and organic molecules, and to be able to describe their importance to living things. And finally, I'd like for you to be able to describe our important life-related macromolecules, and to be able to categorize these substances as nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, or carbohydrates based on their properties and functions in the cell. Alright, so the reason that we are spending time to learn and study these topics is because at the most basic level, organisms are made up of molecules, in a little bit the same way that the structure in the background of this picture is made up of individual Legos. To understand how organisms function, we must first understand the molecules from which we are built. Alright, so let's begin by recognizing that for almost all of human history, human beings were unable to answer one of the most basic and important questions that we could ask about ourselves, which is, what are we made of? It wasn't until the 1600s, and for those of you that need a historical reference, that was when the American colonies were in their infancy, that over on the other side of the Atlantic, a new scientific tool called the microscope was beginning to be used by scientists to investigate the invisible world too small for our unaided eyes to see. And what they saw over and over again, whenever they observed samples from living things, were tiny, basic building block structures that they called cells. So then over the next 200 years, scientists were able to use better and better microscopes to learn more and more about cells. And then eventually, all of the ideas of all of these scientists from all over the world were combined. The combined ideas are known as the cell theory. And today, we can summarize this in 3 statements. First, all organisms are made up of either one cell, like these Paramecia right here, they're single-celled organisms, or they're made of multiple cells, like these giraffe. The second part of the cell theory is that the cell is the smallest unit of organization in all organisms. So what this means is that the cell is the most basic structure within which functions can take place. A metaphor for this that you would be familiar with is how classrooms are the basic organization of a school, because they're the smallest structures in which functions like learning can take place. And just like with living organisms, you can put multiple classrooms together to build a school. In the same way, we can see multiple cells here as the basic unit of organization put together to form the leaf of a plant. Finally, the third part of the cell theory is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. You can see that in the picture here, where it starts with a single cell, and as you look at the time lapse, you can see that this single cell divides and eventually becomes two cells. Now, we will spend a lot of time in Chapter 3 learning and discussing the details of this process, so stay tuned for that. So the last thing that's important to know about this cell theory is that over the centuries that it has been established, the cell theory has been shown to hold true for all living things, no matter how big or small, and no matter how simple or complex. All right, to wrap up our introduction of the cell theory, I wanted to give you a little bit of detail on the way the cell theory developed. Although I'm going to describe it using specific names and dates, you do not need to memorize them. However, what I do want you to be able to do is to be able to explain the idea that these names and dates illustrate, which is that the cell theory was not the work of a single scientist at one place and at one time in history, but instead it was the combined work of many scientists throughout the world and over the course of nearly 200 years. Okay, so let's look at how the cell theory developed. We begin in 1665 with the English scientist Robert Hooke, who used a rudimentary microscope to study samples, including a cork sample, which you see to the right there, and found in these samples these structures which he was the first one to term with the name cells. And the reason he called them these were because to him they looked like the small rooms in monasteries in which monks reside. About a decade later, another scientist, the Dutch scientist Antony van Leeuwenhoek, viewed a sample of pond water under a microscope for the first time and sees and reveals to humankind something extraordinary, and that is that there are microscopic living organisms. This is the very first time that people knew about life beyond what they could see. These microscopic organisms, you can see them here, he gave them the cute name, little beasties. And in so doing, revealed a whole new world of previously unknown living things. Many decades later, in the country of Germany, scientific colleagues Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann, after numerous investigations of plant and animal tissues, concluded that the cell was the basic organization in both plant tissues, shown here next to the botanist Schleiden, and that animal tissues as well, shown here next to Mr. Schwann, were the basic organization in all of these kinds of tissues. And then finally, after another 2 decades, German scientist Rudolf Virchow studied how cells came into existence and proposed that every cell eventually must come from a pre-existing cell. All right, kids, that does it for our discussion on the cell theory. Tomorrow we'll tackle the concept of molecules, and we'll discuss the importance of water in all living things. Have a good night. See you tomorrow.